Bibliophiles of the internet, it is once again time to wrap up what I read in April. Compared to the last few months, April was a bit of a slower reading month for me, but that's not really a surprise. I had a big work trip at the beginning of April, and then I was preparing for another big work event towards the end of April, so I lost some time and energy to those things, which makes sense. But let's get right into it, starting with the first book I read in April, which was Where the Axe is Buried by Ray Naylor. Macmillan Audio kindly granted me early access to the audiobook, which is read by Eunice Wong, but it was actually published on April 1st from MCD Books. This is a futuristic techno-thriller set in a futuristic version of the world where many countries are governed by algorithms that optimize political decision-making, and where the nameless country at the center of this story is ruled over by a tyrannical autocrat who's figured out how to copy his consciousness into new bodies so that his rule never has to end. The story is going back and forth between a bunch of different tech-minded characters from all around the world who are following a mysterious sequence of clues embedded in a new technology meant to imitate human consciousness in a desperate attempt to save humankind from itself. Content warnings for some instances of violence and death, explorations of grief and loss, references to ableism, and depictions of authoritarianism, violent suppression, and unlawful imprisonment. Ray Naylor is making a serious case for himself as one of my new favorite authors. I usually wait until I've read a handful of things from a new-to-me author before declaring them a favorite, but like I said, Ray Naylor is making a really compelling case. I very much enjoyed his debut, The Mountain in the Sea, which I still think about to this day, and this second full-length novel of his just further solidifies his brand of sci-fi and speculative fiction, which is quieter and less action-forward, but very invested in troubling the boundaries of how we understand and define consciousness. This story, as you might guess, is really grappling with the emergence of more and more AI technologies and the disturbing ways that systems of power are evolving as they integrate this technology in the name of efficiency and effectiveness, even before it's been properly vetted. The terrifying truth is that AI is already part of our government, our policing systems, our justice systems, our commerce systems, and it's being integrated and utilized in so many day-to-day interactions that the everyday person might not even realize. And this story is not afraid to criticize how an over-reliance on technology, on AI, not only erodes our humanity, and perhaps more importantly, our ability to access our own humanity, but also inhibits our ability to make nuanced, critical choices. And what really stood out to me about that conversation in this fictional techno-thriller is how the story makes a point to explore how so much criticism of AI often positions the conflict as human versus machine, when actually it's human versus human, because AI is built and programmed by humans, which so many people forget. AI merely reflects back our own biases. It only further enhances our societal flaws. It merely replicates the stigmas and marginalizations that we inflict on each other in society. These technologies don't exist in a void or in a vacuum. Because the humans who build, create, and train this technology are flawed, those flaws become part of the blueprint. That's what a lot of these companies and big government agencies who are adopting AI technology so often get wrong. It's not a clean slate. It's not a magical tool that's able to make complex decisions at a higher rate than humans. It doesn't understand context. There's no nuance. There's no accountability. And the efficiency that so much of this technology touts and promises often comes at an incredibly high price. That is what makes up so much of the tension at the center of this story. We see how good people try to develop new technologies for good reasons, but then the government and the powers that be will find a way to exploit those creations. This story actually has a lot to offer in the way of anti-fascism, anti-authoritarianism. It's not subtle or quiet about any of those messages, and I really appreciate that. My two minor notes are that I feel like the story is slightly mismarketed because the jacket copy makes it sound like all these disparate characters are going to eventually cross paths, team up, work together, when that's actually not the vibe. And secondly, the story just kind of ends abruptly. I wish the ending was a bit more drawn out, but I still thoroughly enjoyed this and I gave it 4.25 stars. Then, on a whim, I decided to finally listen to The Perils of Lady Catherine de Bourgh by Claudia Gray. I listened to the sensational audiobook courtesy of PRH Audio, which is read by Billy Fulford Brown. This is the third book in the Mr. Darcy and Miss Tilney mystery series, which is a really fun series of historical murder mysteries populated by Jane Austen characters, including the two main original characters who are Jonathan, son of the Darcys, and Juliet, daughter of the Tilneys. In this particular story, instead of finding themselves at the scene of a murder as they usually do, Jonathan and Juliet are actually summoned by Lady Catherine, who has been the victim of some horrific attacks and believes that she is being targeted by a murderer. Having heard of Jonathan and Juliet's success in solving other cases, she wants them to track down the killer before the killer can succeed in their attempts. Content warnings for depictions of violence and attempted assault, experienced sexism, experienced ableism and use of ableist language, descriptions of overstimulation, depictions of seizures and epileptic episodes, and brief references to child death. Also worth noting, Jonathan is canonically and heavily coded as autistic. Obviously, because of the time period, the story doesn't use that language, but it's made very clear on the page. This is such a fun mystery series that puts a really creative spin on the Jane Austen universe. It's able to strike a really great balance of paying homage to Austen's beloved characters while still very much forging its own path and giving us dynamic, original characters to root for. Like I said, they usually just find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time where a dead body just happens to show up, and it was fascinating to see how the story was able to maintain a sense of tension and suspense while the would-be murder victim is actually still alive. And I have to give the author credit there, because while I did initially guess who the possible killer could be pretty early on, I second-guessed myself so much, because there's a great deal of people living on Lady Catherine's estate, and the story has so many branching storylines that give credible motives to so many characters. Again, because the victim is actually still alive in this case, it was really interesting to follow how Juliet and Jonathan were able to uncover clues and find creative ways to cross suspects off their list. The premise of this third book, I think, is also a clever way for these characters to spend time with each other again, which is not often feasible for young folks in this time period who are of differing sexes. There's a really delightful slow burn romance going on between Jonathan and Juliet that is just so soft and so sweet, and it's always gratifying to see how they connect. Like I said, I had such a great time with this. I actually ended up blowing through it in just a couple of days, and I could not stop listening to it. The fourth book, I think, is coming out in just a couple of months, and I cannot wait. I gave this third book a very strong 4.5 stars. After that, I finished Of Monsters and Mainframes by Barbara Truelove. I read an arc of this as part of a book tour with Colored Pages Book Tours, and this is set to come out on June 3rd from Bindery Books. This is a really zany mixture of sci-fi and horror. It's told from the perspective of a supercomputer-powered spaceship called Demeter, whose job is to shuttle humans back and forth between Earth and other planets. But unfortunately, all of her passengers keep dying horrific deaths, and Demeter cannot figure out the cause. The company that owns Demeter is ready to decommission her and scrap her for parts, but Demeter suspects that these deaths were not caused by an internal error, but actually by a monster stowing away on board. Content warnings for graphic death, violence, and depictions of blood and injury, and some experiences of memory loss. This story is so delightfully campy and adventurous. It takes classic horror monsters and recontextualizes them in this zany, survival-oriented space opera, and it was just so much fun to read. There's even an element of satire that I really appreciated, because the story is told from the very limited point of view of Demeter, who not only is not programmed to interact with organic creatures, but also doesn't have a body and is very limited in how she can move, how she can physically protect her passengers, and how she can investigate. So the story has to be very clever in how she's able to maneuver in the tools that she has at her disposal in order to give herself some agency when she can be overridden or controlled by outside forces. And I found her very limited POV to be incredibly effective, because it allows the reader to process scenes in surprising and unexpected ways, in more distanced ways as well, while also fueling the story's tension as Demeter basically has to distort and reprogram herself to do things that she was never technically built to do. The story has a really fantastic element of found family as well, which is a dynamic I love so much. There's a zany, hilarious cast of misfit characters at the center of this story. Some humans, some computers, some monsters themselves, who have to band together not only to survive, but ultimately to assert their right to their own existence. As the powers that be relentlessly pursue Demeter and threaten to decommission or reprogram her, we see how prioritizing efficiency, productivity, and a streamlined or standardized way of existing above anything else ultimately does no one any favors, and in fact cuts us off from discovering an untold number of pathways to new and exciting, and yes, transgressive possibilities. The story is really about how our access to those possibilities, even if we never uncover them or experience them for ourselves, is absolutely worth protecting. This was such a fun ride, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then I read my arc of The Influencers by A.M. McLemore, which also just came out on April 15th from the Dial Press. I also listened to the audiobook courtesy of PRH Audio, which is read by Brittany Presley. This is A.M. McLemore's adult debut. It's a literary mystery about this incredibly popular momfluencer known as Mother May I, who built a brand and an empire around parenting and lifestyle content involving her 5 mixed-race daughters. The daughters are all grown up now, and each has their own contentious relationship with the fact that their entire childhoods are online. But to make things worse, their mom's new husband has just been found dead in their mom's mansion, which the killer tried to burn down in an attempt to get rid of the evidence. So now their family is under a very intense microscope as the public tries to figure out whether it was the mom, the daughters, or someone in their inner circles who might have committed this crime. Content warnings for death and violence, experienced racism and colorism, and some instances of both online and in-person harassment. It's no secret that I love A.M. McLemore's work. I have read and enjoyed pretty much every single book that they've written. There's only one I haven't read yet, so naturally I was very much looking forward to their debut in the adult space. In the end, this turned out to be kind of a tricky one for me because I did really like it and I appreciate the story's project and what it's trying to say, but it also left a little bit to be desired in some ways. Where this mystery thriller shines is in its exploration of our relationship to social media, what it means to normalize sharing not insignificant portions of our lives online, and also the toxicity of parasocial relationships and how audiences can feel entitled to access every part of a person's life online. I think that brings a really interesting edge to the mystery in the story, the fact that the family is not only having to defend themselves and establish alibis with police and investigators, but whether or not they consent to it, they're also on trial in the court of public opinion. Again, with this constant blurring of boundaries between in-person interactions and online interactions, we're seeing more and more of these self-proclaimed internet sleuths aiding or even sometimes interfering with ongoing investigations, and the story really leans into that liminal space between what is considered public and what's not, to bring another shade of tension to the story. Structurally, one thing I did really appreciate about this story is that one of the rotating POVs is from the perspective of this family's online audience, and it's kind of told in a collective hive mind voice using collective pronouns like we and us. I thought that was really well done, not only because it reveals so much about audience entitlement and the erosion of personal boundaries on the internet, but because it shows how there are different camps of people even within this shared audience who interact with these family members differently and believe or prioritize different things. With all that said, for me, the story isn't as tight or as suspenseful as I think it needs to be. I think there's a big cast of family members in this story purely because the assumption is that more characters creates more suspense because there's more names in the mix. But for me, there just wasn't enough to justify that amount of characters. There wasn't enough to distinguish the characters from each other and make them all feel distinctive and necessary to the story. So they just kind of end up blurring together and getting lost. Secondly, I feel like the story somewhat overstays its welcome. It feels like there's a natural cutoff point towards the end, and yet the story still takes a while to wrap up after that point. And I think the reader begins to feel the length of the book because aside from the high-profile aspect of the case, there's just not much suspense to the story. Not much meat on the plot bones, so to speak. So I'm kind of torn on this one because thematically I think it's successful and effective, but structurally and cohesively it feels like there was a bit left on the table. So I think I would give this one 3.5 stars. After that, I picked up my Patreon pick for April, which was The Potency of Ungovernable Impulses by Malka Older. I was kindly gifted a review copy from Tor.com, and this comes out later this year on June 10th. This is the third book in a really wonderful sci-fi mystery novella series. It stars the Holmesian duo of Investigator Masa and Professor Pleiti, who are sapphic lovers solving intergalactic crimes. In this particular installment, Masa is struggling with her mental health, and so she and Pleiti are a bit distant when the story starts. For that reason, Pleiti sets off on her own to investigate a case regarding academic sabotage. One of Pleiti's old friends has come seeking help because this friend's cousin is up for a major promotion at a different university, but on the eve of her defense, someone accuses her of plagiarism. But what starts off as an attack on this person's professional reputation quickly turns into something far more dangerous. Content warnings for instances of violence, assault, and injury, brief descriptions of drunkenness, and some explorations of mental health and depressive episodes. This is one of my favorite ongoing series, and I have thoroughly enjoyed myself with each and every new installment, and this one was no different. Again, you're kind of pulled in because there's a different angle on this mystery compared to the previous two. It shakes up the structure for these mysteries that's been established in the first two books. I am not opposed to a little sapphic angst, which this story definitely gives us in the beginning, but even more than just an emotional obstacle for these two characters to overcome, I appreciate how this story very candidly explores depression and how mental health is yet another infrastructural consideration when we think about what it means to establish a whole new society in space. And something I always talk about with this series, something that I think Malka Older continues to do so beautifully, is the fact that each installment parallels the story's main conflict with a conflict being experienced in Masa and Pleiadi's romantic relationship. In this case, the ungovernable impulse Blathy is contending with in the case is people's willingness to uphold the status quo, even when the status quo is not only not serving them, but actively harming them. And the ungovernable impulse putting strain on her relationship with Masa is not only Masa's depression, which is out of anyone's control, but Masa's impulse to distance herself from everyone and everything. I appreciate that the story painstakingly shows how even though our impulses and instincts are meant to protect us, just because they're natural responses doesn't make them inherently correct. How many of those quote-unquote instincts are actually things we've been conditioned to believe or to do? What if our attempts to protect ourselves or insulate ourselves are actually counterproductive? So I thought that was great, and I also respect this third installment for openly interrogating how the amount of powers that institutions wield, especially when it comes to granting legitimacy and authority, can be incredibly seductive, but also incredibly limiting when it comes to expanding our imaginations and even pursuing justice. As an inspector and academic respectively, Masa and Blathy have some level of allegiance to the powers that be, and the legitimacy those institutions grant them professionally is not insignificant, but then they also have to consider the cost of that legitimacy in terms of what they're allowed to pursue, which can be very limited, and whether that's a cost they're willing to pay. There's a lot of interesting things happening in this novella. It's entertaining, it's suspenseful, it keeps you guessing, and I think it also gives you a lot to consider. I think the pacing was slightly off towards the beginning, and I wouldn't consider it to be one of my favorite installments in the series, but it's still incredibly strong, so that's not really saying much. Ultimately, I gave this 4 stars. Purely by coincidence, around the same time I picked up another Holmesian-inspired genre mystery, and that was The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. I listened to the audiobook courtesy of PRH Audio, which is read by Andrew Falaise. Like I said, this is a fantasy mystery starring another very Holmesian duo. The story is actually pitched as Sherlock Holmes meets the world of Attack on Titan because it's set in a fantasy world where different sections of the Empire are protected by huge walls that are meant to protect citizens from leviathans. The story is following an eccentric investigator named Ana de Labra and her new assistant, Dinius Cole, who's been magically altered to permanently remember everything he sees and hears. The two of them are assigned to investigate the death of a high Imperial officer who was killed when a tree sprouted from his body. Content warnings for some experienced ableism, allusions to off-page sexual harassment and sexual assault, and depictions of death, violence, injury, and blood. Also worth noting, Inspector Anna is very heavily coded as neurodivergent, and Cole is canonically dyslexic. I very much enjoyed my time with this. I have to tip my hat to Andrew Falaise, the audiobook narrator, because I think he did an incredible job. He has so many different accents in his toolbox and different shades to his voice that he uses to bring this huge cast of characters to life, and I think he just gave a really wonderful and engaging performance. But like I said, this was such a fun fantasy mystery story. It took a while to figure out how the story's overworld and these huge walls and leviathans tied together with the ongoing mystery, but I think when the two finally connect, it is really satisfying and also opens up the door to some exciting possibilities in future installments. So I'm really excited and curious to see how the series expands on the world being built in this first book. And I think the magic system of characters being able to quote-unquote enhance themselves with superhuman abilities is also really fascinating and brings a refreshing edge to this case. I also absolutely love the Holmesian dynamic between Anna and Cole. Their dialogue is sharp, it's funny, it's eccentric, and it's just really entertaining to see how delightfully mismatched they are in some ways, and yet also the perfect complement to each other in other ways. I think when we talk about Holmes-Watson pairings, we often forget that a key component of that classic dynamic is having a character who is incredibly eccentric, sometimes to the point of annoyance, and who's operating on a completely different level compared to everyone else. Inspector Anna beautifully fulfills that role, and in doing so, makes the mystery itself feel very classic. The story has those moments where she already has everything figured out based on observations only she can make, and the question becomes less about who did it and why, and instead becomes about how the puzzle pieces fit together to construct a clear narrative. Neither Anna nor Cole truly fits the image of what an authority figure might be. They both have their own moral compasses and ways of doing things that don't always align with the norm. But again, that's what makes their investigations so fun and dynamic. Thematically, I also appreciate how this story is asking the bigger question of what does it mean to pursue justice when both working within and living at the mercy of an empire that is inherently unjust. There's a tension there. There's an easy pathway to cynicism laid at these characters' feet, but we see again and again how they choose to walk a different path and choose instead to focus on what they can control and change within the system, even if it's on a much smaller scale than they might like. I'm really glad I finally started this series. With its unique blend of fantasy elements and classic mystery tropes and stylization, it is very much up my alley. I would give this first book 4 stars. After that, because I am a bad Reformed Catholic and I guess I just want to solidify the fact that I am going to hell, I read Conclave by Robert Harris. I was kindly gifted a finished copy by Vintage Books. Whether you've seen the Oscar-winning film adaptation, which is fucking incredible, by the way, or not, I'm sure you've heard this title being bandied about recently because of the Pope's recent passing. It is what it is. This is sort of a slow burn literary thriller about a fictional pope who dies very suddenly, and the story is told from the perspective of Cardinal Lamelli, the dean of the College of Cardinals, whose job is to oversee the following conclave, which is the process by which a new pope is elected to office. Naturally, there are favorites and frontrunners, but the deeper they get into the election process, the more the dean realizes that some of these candidates are very corrupt and underhanded. They have their own agendas and their own allies, and the burden of trying to make the right choice quickly turns the conclave to madness. Content warnings for death, some fatphobic language, some descriptions of racism, homophobia, and sexism, especially how they are perpetuated within the Catholic Church, brief references to victims of gang violence, rape, and abuse, and some descriptions of terrorist violence. First off, if you haven't seen the film adaptation of Conclave, I highly recommend it because it whips ass, and it does not matter if you are especially religious or not. I myself am a proudly Reformed Catholic, because it is not necessarily glorifying or even exploring religion or Catholicism in the first place. I guess we can start there because as a non-religious person, what I deeply respect about this story in either form is that it's really grappling with and sitting with the tension at the heart of so many Western and or Abrahamic religions, which is that they call for purity of spirit, humility, and selflessness, and yet these religions also wield very tangible and quantifiable amounts of institutional power that are controlled by people who are inherently flawed, if not outright corrupt. And to be clear, the story is also not attempting to vilify Catholicism or religion either. It's not a takedown of Catholicism or making broad overtures about how every Catholic official is secretly a criminal. But like I said, it is contending with the fact that the church is an institution and how instances of corruption are usually swept beneath the rug in order to maintain that institution's power and image. And I think the reason the story works from both a religious and non-religious perspective is because it's told from the point of view of Dean Lamelli, who is intensely human and intensely conflicted because he feels the weight of responsibility and the urgency required of this conclave to not only agree on who they should elect in the first place, but to elect the right person because of what that person will come to both control and represent. He's also very openly questioning and doubting his own relationship with faith, which not only adds to the story's tension, but also makes him much more approachable no matter which direction you're coming from, and perfectly positions him as the right person to guide this conclave because he has a healthy sense of skepticism. This is just a really unique story. Structurally and tonally, it does really read as a thriller of sorts. There's tension, there's suspense, there are unexpected revelations and twists and turns that make the election process anything but straightforward. And again, because this position comes with so much power and responsibility, that naturally heightens the stakes. There's just something really compelling about how this story is told. I basically read it in 2 sittings, and once I started, it was very hard to stop turning the pages. It's well researched, it's deeply fascinating, it has a lot to say about separating the experience of faith from its man-made institutions, and I would definitely read more from this author if his other books are anything like this. I will say, because the the plot moves so swiftly, the story isn't always able to properly contend with every idea or development along the way, and some of the ideas it touches on do deserve a bit more nuance, but that's a fairly minor note. I still gave this 4.5 stars. Then to support the disability readathon, I decided to pick up a nonfiction book called Against Techno-Ableism, Rethinking Who Needs Improvement by Ashley Shu. I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Maria Pendolino. This is a very short collection of essays written by a disabled bioethicist and professor who is presenting arguments against techno-ableism, which basically put is the concept that disability can be quote-unquote cured or even eliminated with the right technological advancements. This very common narrative pushes the harmful idea that disabled people inherently desire to function, move, and exist at the baseline of quote-unquote normality established by able-bodied neurotypical populations, as opposed to the fact that most disabled people would simply be better served in a less systemically ableist world. Content warnings for explorations of experienced ableism and systemic ableism, references to medical racism and abuse, ableist violence, Nazi practices during the Holocaust, and other eugenic practices, and brief non-graphic references to depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicide. This is an incredibly effective and informative primer on the issue of techno-ableism and how it impacts disabled folks. It really talks about the prevalent societal narrative that disability can be quote-unquote solved with the right forms of technology, which is simply not true and shouldn't even be the end goal in the first place. Even though people have tried, we cannot stop people from becoming disabled, either through birth or experience or time, and that shouldn't even be our focus to begin with because there's nothing wrong with being disabled. Instead of hiding our discomfort with disability behind technologies that only further perpetuate the inspirational disability narrative, our focus and our concern should instead be regarding how we can make society and the world we live in more accessible and less ableist. Even though this is a very concise collection of essays, I appreciate the amount of nuance the author brings to this conversation. She's not arguing against any kind of technologies that improve disabled people's lives or make their lives a bit easier. She herself uses a prosthesis and other forms of technology, but at the same time, she affirms that dismantling ableism and making the world easier for disabled people to exist in and navigate is a far more pressing concern. And I also appreciate that she talks about how if we're going to have a comprehensive discussion about techno-ableism, we can't only talk about the advancements in disabled technology, but also the forms of technology that are used against disabled people, eugenic tools and practices, unsanctioned surgeries, forced sterilization. These are also prevalent forms of disabled technology that either harm or eliminate disabled folks. I also deeply respect how the author makes space to celebrate the disabled imagination and disabled futurism while also having conversations about how technologies made for disabled people shouldn't only have to be about function and access. There should be technologies that enhance joy and create an even richer lived experience. And to that end, the book also argues that disabled people should be able to take technologies that already exist and use them even in ways they perhaps weren't intended to be used in order to, again, enhance their own experience or improve their lives. Either way, disabled people should be at the forefront of these conversations when we talk about these technologies and how they're developed, especially when, ironically, so much technology is allegedly made for them that in the end they either can't afford or can't access. So again, this is a super informative book, really short and easy to read. The voice in these essays is incredibly personable and engaging, and there's just a lot you can take away from each section. I do appreciate that it's structured in an accessible way where each chapter stands on its own and can be read in any order, but I do think because of that it also ends a bit abruptly and could have used a concluding section to tie everything together. So I gave this 4.75 stars. And shortly after that I picked up Hunchback by Saoi Ichigawa, translated by Polly Barton from the original Japanese. I listened to the audiobook read by Yuriri Naka. This is an incredibly short piece of fiction about a main character who was born with a congenital muscle disorder and relies on an electric wheelchair and ventilator to get around, especially in the rare instances when she ventures outside of her care home. But besides being a student, she has a somewhat unexpected kind of job, which is that she's a freelance writer who publishes erotic stories on the internet. And she also troll tweets from anonymous accounts just to see if anyone responds. One day she posts something incredibly risque about wishing that someone would impregnate her, and she is shocked when someone in her real life not only finds that tweet, but agrees to do it in exchange for a ton of cash. Content warnings for discussions regarding pregnancy and abortion, explorations of both experienced and internalized ableism, and some explicit sexual content. This was a startling, disarming, somewhat uncomfortable story, and I think purposefully so. I'm still very much processing it, but I just want to start by acknowledging that the experience of this main character is so far out of my lane, and for that reason, I cannot speak to the quality of this representation orientation. I say the story is startling not because the fact that disabled people experience sexuality is a surprise, it's not, but because the story is centering an incredibly messy character who acts and thinks in aggressively unexpected ways. I appreciate that though, because it's a kind of reclamation of agency and a disruption of disabled stereotypes. To that end, this story is absolutely exploring the phenomenon of how disabled people are not only stripped of their sexuality, but often categorized as sexless, regardless of what their relationship with sexuality might actually be, regardless of whether they're interested in sex or not. It's absolutely pushing back against that assumption, not only with this character's leanings towards erotica, but because she's also seeking a kind of intimacy and choice that she isn't afforded because of her disabilities. I thought there was a really interesting parallel and interplay between the two main characters of the story, because through their troubling relationship, they're both seeking access to things they've been systematically denied. One of them is seeking access to wealth, and the other is seeking access to casual intimacy. And in that sense, the story also parallels the experiences of intimacy that people often take for granted. The main character needs assistance to shower, for example, and so we see how that simple act of allowing yourself to be cleaned can be very vulnerable and also very fraught, which directly maps onto the two characters' sexual dynamic as well. Like I said, I'm still very much processing this one, and I don't have a rating or a final verdict to share at the moment. I do think it accomplishes a lot in a short amount of space and gives the reader a lot to consider without being too heavy-handed or overstaying its welcome. Ultimately, I am glad I read this. And lastly, for the month, I listened to The West Passage by Jared Pachecek, which is read by Steve West. This is a very strange yet enticing medieval fantasy set in a palace the size of a city that's ruled over by giant ladies of unknowable eldritch origins. They're basically the protectors of this palace, guarding humans from a terrible beast that lurks beneath the surface. And one day, the guardian of the West Passage passes away in her sleep, and in violation of the ancient traditions, a successor is not named in her place. So the passage is unprotected. And now it's up to her nameless apprentice to journey to the next tower, the Black Tower, to try and convey his mistress's final message, which is that the beast is coming once more. Content warnings for depictions of death, some instances of injury and violence, and brief instances of animal cruelty and animal death. I don't know that I've ever read anything quite like this. It truly is a pretty even blend of fantasy, medieval storytelling, and weird fiction. It goes to some bizarre places, and it's one of those stories that very slowly reveals the fantasy world starting from the inside and working its way outwards, but I really enjoy just following the story wherever it wanted to go. I love how the medieval part of this medieval fantasy isn't necessarily describing the setting or aesthetics of the story, but more so describing the characteristics of the storytelling itself. This is definitely a classic medieval quest story, actually 2 times over, because the 2 main characters are on concurrent quests that eventually force them to cross paths. But it has that classic feel to it because even though there's a clear end goal, there are even more adventures and challenges that waylay these characters along their respective paths. So it kind of ends up reading like stories upon stories within a story, with each new section having that allegoric and didactic feel to it. And while it might sound pointless or frustrating to have the characters being drawn in different directions, it actually ends up making the endgame feel that much more satisfying because all those side quests not only tie together, but further underscore what the characters have gone through and sacrificed in order to get where they are in the end. This is definitely both a quirky and dark fantasy adventure. There's a sense of humor and whimsy underlying the logic of this fantasy world and the characters who reside within it. And because it was so fascinatingly off-kilter, I just loved every second I was immersed in that fantasy world. But even more than just the stylistic choices, I really respect what this story is exploring thematically. It's exploring how easy it is for us to forget that the rules that govern our own lives don't also necessarily govern the world. And so what happens when you're plucked out of your orbit and forced to confront how little of the world you're actually equipped to understand? And because so much of this story is about ancient traditions being disrupted, it's asking really big questions about how much of what we do is because it's the right thing to do, and how much of what we do is because of the narratives and instincts that have been passed down to us and ingrained within us. Especially when we talk about preserving history from a societal point of view, often what we're trying to preserve isn't actually fully realized, fully contextualized history, but rather a dominant group's version of history that aligns with their own narrative. So how do we divest from that, and how do we recognize the difference? I appreciate this story for having those conversations, making those points, and integrating those questions into this deeply fantastical, whimsical, weird little story. I was very impressed by it and would definitely read more from this author in the future. I gave this 4.5 stars. So there you have it. That is everything I read in April. Oddly enough, it turned out to be a pretty mystery-heavy month, which was unexpected but not unwelcome. But as always, if you read any of these yourself or if you plan to, I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.